So, and we'll share the recording afterwards if you want to listen back. So for those of you who haven't joined before, we have a regular call this time every Tuesday. We've been running it since we went into lockdown at the beginning of the COVID-19 phenomenon, if that's the right word, probably not the right word. And we've been exploring various themes relating to sales and marketing to the enterprise. About 2 weeks ago, we launched our customer buying index. So last week and this week, we're going to explore some of the issues coming out of that index. It's really a survey of buyers in the very largest companies across the US, UK and Europe, looking at how they approach the challenge of making their biggest bet, tech investments. So the survey is limited to companies with, I think, revenues of over $30 billion, and the investment has to be greater value than $3 million. So we're talking about the biggest deals at the biggest companies. It's going to be, this was the first index we launched a couple of weeks ago. It's going to be a regular biannual pulse we're going to be taking. And on this call, I'm pleased to say I'm joined by Chris Hooper, who heads up Momentum's North American operation based in Seattle, to talk about some of the findings and implications of the index for the North American market. So Chris, maybe we can just start by you giving us a quick intro on both what your role is. And you're in quite a unique position, or not unique, but unusual position in that you've done ABM in Europe and you've done ABM in North America, which makes you quite interesting, amongst many other reasons, obviously. But also it might be worth just kind of sketching in your background before you came to Momentum. You're on mute, I think, at the moment. But just to kind of set the scene in terms of who you are before we kind of get into the conversation. Chris.
Okay. Can you hear me okay then? Is that okay?
Yes, fine. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I think I'll start with the second part of that first, if that's all right, Rob, and just give a bit of background. So I actually come from a sort of content strategy background. To be honest, I started off as a journalist actually many years ago, sort of writing, reporting on, and editing on news stories, business and finance, tech stories, and things like that for a number of national newspaper titles in the UK. And I think that gave me a really good grounding. I didn't really realize it at the time, I don't think, but it gave me a great grounding for my move to B2B marketing and then into eventually ABM. I think it's sort of the main sort of factors for that were just sort of figuring out what a good story is, how to construct a narrative around sometimes sort of disparate events. And I think most crucially, how to make sometimes very complicated subjects understandable for audiences that may have little to no understanding, previous knowledge of that subject. And like I said, I didn't really know it at the time, but that paved the way for a move into B2B marketing, where I worked with a number of fairly big, mostly tech, but also financial services companies in both the US and the UK, with their sort of C-suite conversations and trying to sell to sort of high level customers. I think that the move to ABM was quite an obvious one given my background in some ways. And I joined Momentum in the early part of 2019, initially as content director, where I oversaw the content output for both our London office and the US office, which is based in Seattle. And in the course of that role, it became apparent fairly quickly that the content operation we were running in London was a lot more robust, a lot more mature, and that's obvious given that we've been doing it for 9 years, and the team there were very well established. And so I found more and more of my work was pulling me into sort of the work with our US clients. And then the sort of natural conclusion to that was in January of this year, I moved to Seattle to take over the running of our Seattle branch, our US. So I've been doing it for the last 6 months now. It's a common, sort of a lifetime's worth of experience working on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay. Great. Thanks for the intro, Chris. To people who joined the call, I should have begun by saying thank you for joining the call. It's very bad manners on my part. Please feel free to jump in and ask questions directly. you don't have to sit there and listen to me and Chris talk, but please, take part in the conversation if you feel so minded. I wanted to begin, Chris, by looking at some of the insights the index gave into buyer motivations for their, as I said, for their big bet tech investments. Now, obviously, it's no surprise that efficiency and competitiveness feature highly on that list as to what are the drivers. But in both cases, they're significantly higher in the US, North America, than they are in Europe. I just wondered what your thoughts were around why that might be the case, and what does that mean for the work that you're doing and you're leading.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as to sort of the reasons why, I think I've got a couple of theories really. I think that with efficiencies especially, and I think we've seen this certainly in the last few months with the COVID-19 and the sort of subsequent lockdowns. But I think that efficiency has always been a top of mind with US businesses. I think that there's a much bigger cultural acceptance of efficiencies. I think when we talk about it in the UK, it's often associated with job losses and has a lot of negative connotations. But I think in the US, at least, there's more of a business focus where efficiencies are sort of seen as more acceptable. And that's certainly reflected in the CBI data that we've published, where we're talking about the average size of buying teams, for example, where they're often smaller in the US than they are in the UK and EMEA. And I think that's sort of goes back to that fact where teams are sort of a lot leaner. They run with a lot less sort of fat on them, which is a good thing. I don't think they sort of shy away from efficiencies at all. I think where it sort of links into competition is that the US is an incredibly competitive internal market. In a number of different sectors. I mean, I think if you were looking at, we're talking about the home of free market capitalism, so of course it's going to be. But it's, if we're talking about financial services, for example, which is one of my sort of backgrounds, I think if in investment banking, the top 20 of the largest full service investment banks, I think 3 are based in Japan, 2 Switzerland, 2 British, 1 German, 1 French, and then 11 are based in North America, 2 in Canada and 9 in the US. And so that just illustrates, I think, that the high level of competition that's involved with these companies. And when you have that, it's very hard to find, if we're focusing on those 11 financial services companies, there's very hard to find a differentiation between them other than how efficiently they run their operation. So I think that's quite often the main sort of competitive advantage is who can do it the most efficiently. I think when we're looking at that from an ABM point of view, I mean, what does that mean for us? I think you have to be strategically more agile. I think the landscape is changing so quickly. I mean, especially the last couple of months have illustrated this more than anything. That you have to be able to provide insight that I think is timely for and actionable for that particular moment, because in 2 weeks, a month from now, that could be completely different. So I think you have to have an element of agility built in. I would argue that there's a sort of a content angle to it as well, where your content needs to be ultra tailored to address the specific business need around efficiency. It's a subject, as I said, that is sort of top of mind at the moment. But really, to jump back to the financial services example again, it's been something that's been talked about for the last decade, at least. I think that providing automation for back office operations, for example, things around know your customer checks, anti-money laundering, policy quote generation, those kind of things. They are sort of all ripe for automation, but each one of those 11 companies we mentioned earlier on is going to be a different stage of their journey for each one of those facets of their business. So you have to tailor your content specifically to that need in order to have any sort of cut through at all. I think generically speaking, generic business content is just doesn't work at all with these guys. So I think that's really the main link between efficiency and ABM that I can see.
Okay, and sort of building on that, also there was quite a marked difference in terms of the level of the index really looks at C-suite executives only. So it's CIO, CMO, CFO, COO, and so on. And it seems that decision making in Europe is much more centralized, in that there is a higher degree of involvement from the C-suite, so they have much more control over those investment decisions. In North America, it seems to be much more decentralized, to the point where, in Europe, the number of people actually in lower ranking roles involved is negligible. In the US, there is definitely more involvement by those more junior people. So tell me about that kind of decentralization. And like part two of my question before you answer is, does that make ABM easier in the US or harder, that decentralized?
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting, and this was a point that was jumped on actually when you presented this CBI data for the first time. Tony Miller, who was on our panel, he was sort of is a marketing director at Weight Watchers, but has also worked for Disney in the US and a number of different companies on both sides of the Atlantic. It was his opinion that that US companies are generally more siloed, and that's the reason for this sort of division, almost departmental division like that. Sort of a move away from the C-suite towards the sort of departmental teams. I think he's far more experienced than me in these matters, so I do defer to his view. But I think I would add to it that, in my opinion, in the conversations that we've had, the responsibility for innovation to drive efficiency often sits with the departmental teams. And this is almost a sort of a cultural delegation of responsibility. And it means that this sort of teams are often the drivers of this stuff, with the board taking the role of more being green lighting the project or not, as the case may be. Now, whether that makes ABM more harder, I think it's a difficult one to answer. I think if you're dealing with a specific team that who are addressing a specific business problem, then it's easier because you know what your audience target is. I think if your strategic insight towards that account is robust, if you're correctly reading the intent data, if you're aware of the fact that the company are in the market for a certain piece of software, for example, if your stakeholder mapping is accurate, I think then you can act accordingly. So in some ways, it does make it easier. However, so one further point I'd probably like to make on this is that knowing the sort of the setup of the functional team proposing the sort of tech purchase and not the board, it gives a vendor a great angle to sort of position themselves as a trusted partner to those team members. So, if a vendor, through the sort of the content that they can create, can help those buying team members win the arguments they need to win internally, especially at board level, then they are sort of infinitely more likely to make a sale, in my opinion. So, acting as sort of a confidant, shepherding the buying team through the buying process, and being in their corner when they need to justify their belief, in whether the purchase decision is the right one. I think that's essentially what a trusted partner is. So I think that's a bit of a roundabout way of answering, but I think in some ways it does make it easier, but in some ways it's a more advantageous position to be in as well for an ABM practitioner.
Okay, great. So I'm going to pause for a moment there just to ask if anybody on the call wants to jump in with a question for Chris. Give you a chance to put your hand up if you want to ask a question. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Robert? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Lovely. So this is Shikha from ThoughtWorks, and I'm part of the ABM team, and I'm running ABM campaigns for financial services vertical. So something that you mentioned about FS specifically, and that really got me interested, was about efficiency and tailoring the content. So I mean, efficiency is kind of a broad topic, and you mentioned that it would help to tailor the content. I guess the challenge is, like, in the runtime, how do you actually come up with a content pipeline that is relevant and also so specifically tailored to their needs? So do you have any tips or recommendations around what sort of ways can be used to sort of speed up the content development, more so from a personalization perspective that would cater to kind of specific target audience needs?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think within financial services is a very good example for this. Actually, I think that there are certain elements of your content that you can almost pre-create, and this sort of process can work in parallel to your strategic insight. So in the time it takes you to discover an opportunity in a particular account, you would have pre-created some content around the issue of efficiency in certain areas of financial services. Some of which I mentioned earlier on. Certainly around automation. I think that's one that comes up all the time with these types of clients. So I think if you can sort of start to pre-create some of that stuff and have it in your locker, when the strategy, when the insight work and the sort of the horizon mapping and that kind of horizon scanning sort of throws up these opportunities, you're almost halfway there already, because your audit at that point is sort of tailoring the content to the particular client that you're talking to and the particular business need that they have, which as you will probably know from your already, I think it's a lot more time saving to have something ready made than it is to start from scratch. So I think that would be my sort of my main piece of advice, is to get that sort of content engine working as quickly as possible, and then you can sort of tailor it at a later date. I think it's also it's also worth keeping in mind that understanding a business need is something that is, as I said earlier, sort of constantly changing. So to have your insight pulses need to be we've been advising weekly over the last sort of few months, because that's how quickly things are turning. But if it's bi-weekly or monthly or whatever it may be, whatever your sort of preferred cadence is, that's fine. But I think you need to have them as often as possible linked to sort of actionable insight that comes out of it. So here's some information about a particular customer. What do you have to do with it? So your sales teams are equipped with information that they can act on very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Shika, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. That's very, very helpful. And that's kind of what I'm sort of laying the groundwork for currently. So having that content engine sort of working, and, laying out the fundamentals of, what are the key themes for the financial services sector, what are the key issues and challenges that they're dealing with, and sort of mapping that back to, how ThoughtWorks can help, and, how we can bring to fore our offerings, kind of mapping to the customer's needs. So that's definitely helpful. And sorry, I've just got one additional point around, some kind of propping it up with more data points, which I guess is a more of a difficult process. So what can we do in terms of gathering the real sort of viewpoints from industry experts? So let's say if there's an issue around automation of back office operations. So this is something, let's say that ThoughtWorks thinks, or our subject matter experts might come up with a few suggestions. But do you also think, like, if we are able to gather an industry perspective from real CXOs who are facing that challenge in the industry, do you think that would be something of interest for the FS type of audience?
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes, I do. I think that there are certain things that you're going to have to sort of lay out in terms of the argument you lay across. When we're talking about understanding a business need, I think that's the first step. But how do you then articulate that into an argument that is going to be convincing enough to sell your product is another matter altogether. And I think that having a bank of experts to call upon is a good way of adding authority to what it is that you're saying. I think that for the most part too, when we talk about understanding a business need, it's quite often knowing what the problem is one thing, proposing your solution is another. But I think you also need to be road mapping what that solution process looks like as well. So I think it's going to be this is the end state for you. We need to work back from that and provide it could be 6 months, a year, 18 months, however long the process is. And every stage along that process, in that roadmap, you have to be able to use your experts to justify a number of things, but justify certainly ROI. That's going to be a big one. And we find that with dealing with our US clients all the time. There's a real, and I think this goes back to that efficiency point we were making at the start of this conversation, actually, where if you can justify your spend, it seems to be a lot more so in the US than in the UK. You need to sort of justify the spend and the amount of profit that it's going to make. And if you can do that at various stages along that roadmap, I think that would be incredibly helpful. And if you have the backup of the it could be sort of an evidential base of case studies that you've done before with sort of very competitors or similar industries, or you have the thought the weight of your thought leaders in that as well. I think that's an incredibly compelling argument.
Yep, that's very helpful. Thank you.
So just building on that, Chris, I wanted to talk about inspiration and inspiration versus information. Because again, one of the big themes that took me by surprise a little bit was the degree to which enterprise buyers don't just want information from their vendors; they want inspiration. And in fact, I think for the US, when we asked buyers in the US, what factors might lead to a delay or a roadblock with a deal, a quarter of them cited lack of inspiration from the vendor, which I think was quite an extraordinary data point. So how do you set about inspiring those buyers? What does inspiration mean in this sense, and how do you approach that challenge?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting this. And yeah, you're absolutely right, Robert. And for me, it was one that jumps out to my eye as well. And I think that it's quite an interesting point because again, I think it ties back to that efficiency point we were making at the start of this conversation. I feel like a lot of departmental heads and maybe C-suite members as well, actually, are so consumed in the need for efficiency that they almost don't have time or bandwidth to think about the future and think about what innovation is going to be like for them. So effectively, they're sort of dependent on vendors or suppliers to imagine that for them, which I think one of the panelists when you were presenting described it as sort of outsourcing innovation, which I thought was a really sort of interesting phrase. And so I think that companies in the US are a lot more prepared to accept that an external tech provider is going to be able to know their future better than they do. We've had conversations with C-suite members where they've said as much, actually, where they've sort of said that, look, we understand that the future of our business is going to be tech, but we don't understand tech enough to know what that future is going to be like. So what we need from vendors is to have that demonstrated to us and then show us how we're going to get there, which is again that sort of road mapping point I was just making. But I think it also comes in and what we need to factor in here too is the sort of the creativity element as well to the messaging that's going across. And this is that sort of age old thing, sort of the B2B B2C world where B2B content is traditionally more sort of rational. And I think when you're talking to CFOs and CIOs, and it is mostly those two. There are other members of the C-suite involved too, but it's primarily those two roles. That people from that background are often very rational and analytical in the way that they think. So if I think your content has to play to that a little bit, but that doesn't mean to say that you can't you can't abandon your creative side too, because I think that we found that in conversations certainly with CIOs, they are bombarded with content, sort of B2B sort of product content and things like that, almost on a daily basis actually. So in order for your information to stand out, it needs to really sort of have something about it. It needs to be a little bit different. It needs to have that sort of creative element worked into it, really, I think, if it's to have any chance of being consumed at all, and certainly sort of to be acted upon. So that applies to the types of formats that we're using over here. So video is an obvious one, direct mail is another, and I think in recent times we have sort of virtual events have kind of come to the fore a little bit as well. But I think it's not just the format; it's also the messaging that's contained within that asset. So you obviously have to catch someone's attention, but once you have their attention, you have to be able to converse with them on a level of wanting to help them solve their business problem, whatever that may be, and also demonstrate to them that you can do that.
Okay, great. So I think we've got time for just one more point. So Chris, when you first went over to Seattle, I remember you called me at one point and said, you've got to come over to Seattle, Robert, because ABM over here is quite different to ABM in Europe. And obviously, because of the lockdown, I've not been able to get over there. But what's your kind of high-level take on the differences between ABM in London, say, versus Seattle? What would you kind of call out as being some of the kind of key differences?
Sure. Okay. I think the biggest difference by far actually is there's two main ones to talk about. I think one of them we kind of covered already. I think that that sort of outsourcing of innovation piece is something I've seen a lot more here than in the UK. Okay. And I think that's from an ABM point of view, that's quite an interesting one, because in some ways the first challenge is trying to catch someone's attention. As we said, with any sort of piece of marketing content, that's what you're really trying to do. But in this instance, it seems that that these companies are already open to that conversation, and further than that, they're sort of saying, please provide this stuff for us. We want you to innovate for us and then show us how to get there. So you've almost got one foot in the door already. And I think that's the first step towards that sort of, that coveted holy grail of trusted partner status, isn't it? That if you're invited in like that to sort of really, really embed yourself in the buying process of a customer, you can then sort of help drive decisions in the future. I mean, that's the very definition of what a trusted partner is, in my opinion. The second point is around the sort of involvement of buying teams, and I think we had a stat in the data somewhere that was around the level of involvement from procurement teams. I think that any US content that we create here has to speak to ROI. There's absolutely no doubt about it. If there isn't sort of someone on the board who's calling this stuff out, there is usually someone on the buying team who is a procurement representative who will be asking the question around any big tech purchases. The three big questions they're asking are what does this cost, what's it going to make us, and how long is it going to take to implement. So if you can equip if we can equip these guys with the answers to those questions, again, it really pushes us towards establishing that sort of trusted partner status, which is so sort of highly coveted. And I think that those are the two real big standouts for me as sort of differences in the UK and the US.
Okay, super, great, thanks. Well, we're pretty much out of time today. Thank you so much, Chris, for giving us points of view on North America. I say the call has been recorded, so if you want access to that, please drop a note to Alexandra Koenig, or Alex, who's on this call, and she'll happily share that with you. If you want to share the recording with colleagues, that's the same thing. If you want to talk to Chris directly, obviously reach out directly to Chris. I'm sure he'll be happy to kind of pursue the conversation afterwards. But for now, I want to say thank you very much for joining the call. I hope it was interesting, and look forward to talking further. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.